Among those who have argued for the Holocaust as a symptom or as revealing of certain profound aspects of modernity is the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman produced a very influential study called Modernity and the Holocaust, and part of his starting point was to argue against the view that the Holocaust was to be understood as a peculiarity of German historical development. That really all we have to do if we want to understand the Holocaust is understand how Germany in some ways had failed to modernize fully. That it had failed to integrate the benign rationalization and moral progress that had been advanced by the modern ideals of the Enlightenment. On the contrary, Bauman argues that the Holocaust was not an atavistic aberration, not an inexplicable regression to pre-modern barbarity, but rather that the Holocaust was thoroughly modern in its origins, its conception, and its execution. Now, in order to understand Bauman's argument, we need to return to the Enlightenment and to some of the founding principles of this new rationalistic approach to the world that emerged in the early modern period and continues to irrigate our contemporary societies. The Enlightenment was a broad cultural, philosophical movement of the 17th and primarily 18th century that built on some of the great scientific triumphs of the age, the discoveries of Newton, his paradigmatic, for instance, and took great faith in the power of human reason. And on the basis of this, Enlightenment figures claimed that all aspects of nature and society needed to be questioned through scientific and philosophical inquiry. That to be modern would be to reject superstition, existing beliefs and prejudices, and to submit our understanding of the world entirely to rational questioning. And that on the basis of that, the superior understanding of the world, after all, Newton had discovered the fundamental laws of motion that animate the stars and their solar bodies, as well as the movement of objects on Earth. On the basis of that greater understanding, we might be able to reorder our societies for the benefit of all humanity. Now, the claim of thinkers like Bauman is that modern genocide is an unwitting outgrowth of these notions, that the kind of social engineering that was implied by the Enlightenment, the kind of social engineering that was thought to lead ultimately to some kind of perfect society, this was an important component of the modern expression of genocide. Since if the objective is to radically reorganize society, to produce a perfect society, then it may well come to be that certain individuals or groups are deemed to stand in the way of this progress, or to be groups that have no place in the future society and therefore have to be removed or eliminated. They are, in a sense, surplus humans. Bauman illustrates this point by arguing that there are, in a sense, two metaphors, models that could stand in for the modern understanding of society. The first is the gardening metaphor. And the Enlightenment period was one that was very fond of ordered, geometrically pleasing gardens. The gardening metaphor implies that one has to care for vegetation and to distinguish cultured plants, the ones that whose growth we want to encourage, those that we need to take care of, and to isolate the weeds, the undesirable plants that need to be eliminated. A second metaphor would be the medical one. That if medicine is, or modern medicine is premised on the isolation of malign elements, the identification of virus, bacteria, other hostile bodies that need to be isolated and removed in order for healthy bodies and organs to thrive. If that is so, then we may well want to start thinking about society as an organism. And if the society is an organism that needs to be healthy but is prone to disease, then we may also end up identifying those malign elements within the social body that threaten its health. It's therefore not surprising that much of the propaganda around the Holocaust was premised on talking about Jewish populations in those medicalized terms of describing Jews as either parasites or viruses. This French poster, contemporary with the Second World War, explains that tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer are all curable, but that we have to finish the job with the greatest of diseases, the Jew. Or to find Adolf Hitler saying in 1942 that the discovery of the Jewish virus is one of the greatest revolutions to have taken place in the world. Germany will only regain its health by eliminating the Jew. I think it's very important to see this in the context of a broader biologization of political and social thinking. A tendency increasingly to think of society as through the lens of biology, as organisms. And that this in turn has to be related to a racialization of European conceptions of identity from the late 19th century. So that, of course, when we talk about the Holocaust, we cannot forget that as barbaric and irrational in some ways as the Holocaust may appear, it was grounded on what were thought to be scientific racial theories that were originally developed in the 19th century in an attempt to apply rational principles in the classification and ordering of races. And of course this occurs in the late 19th century partly as a way of justifying in scientific terms the then dominance of European societies on the world. If large swathes of the world were then under European domination, it was believed to be due to the inherent, innate racial superiority of European societies, of the white race. But also at the very moment where, in a sense, this scientific racial theory was developed as a celebration of Western domination, it was also accompanied by a great amount of fear and trepidation. Fear of what was called miscegenation, the mixture of races. The idea that the white race would be weakened progressively by its mixture with non-white races. And further, the fear of degeneration, that European white societies were becoming too soft and that weaker members of those races would eventually weaken the societies as a whole. It's in this context that we see the emergence of a movement of eugenics, the idea that it is possible and desirable to guide, to self-direct human evolution. Of course, this is all happening in the context of Darwinian thinking that had become very prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the eugenics movement was a very broad movement. It had branches of it in the Anglophone world, in the United States, in Scandinavia, in many European parts or Western parts of the world, the idea that there needed to be a concerted effort to preserve racial stock, to preserve the genes or the natural characteristics, biological characteristics, inherited characteristics of human populations for society to thrive. And so we should not, again, be so surprised when a prominent ideologist of Nazism, as Rudolf Hess, could define National Socialism as nothing but applied biology, claimed a mantle of scientific rational thinking by deriving political principles from what was thought to be hard science. Now, we have to understand the emergence of this kind of thinking in the wider context of modernity. Because one of the effects of modernization and the rapid change of Western societies in the 19th and early 20th century is that it resulted in an erosion of traditional social structures and religious belief. Of course, Enlightenment in parts was motivated by this idea that we should challenge existing beliefs. And in developing societies, industrial societies saw a much greater fluidity in their social boundaries, in even the place of individuals, much greater mobility. This, of course, was part of the Enlightenment or modern program in a sense. Individuals should aspire to greater freedom to define themselves. They should not be defined at birth by social rank or by their existing position in the social order. And so there's a liberation, of course, that comes from that. But associated with that liberation is also a great source of anxiety, much greater existential uncertainty about where people's place was in society. And so it's perhaps not surprising then that alongside the celebration of individual self-determination that we see in the 19th century, again, think also about the place of Romanticism and the idea of creation and individuals being free to become what they want, ideas that actually still, of course, very prevalent in our contemporary societies. Along this celebration, we see also the exalted embrace of new forms of collective identification. So as all the forms of collective identification, such as religious, for instance, declined, we see new categories for group identification, specifically, primarily, nationalist. It's in the 19th century that the nation-state comes together, that states acquire very clear national identifications, and that nationalist passions are unleashed. So that while individuals are also claiming individual freedoms and liberties, they are simultaneously investing themselves in new forms of group identity, which end up drawing up new boundaries between groups. And so racism can be seen as a particularly exacerbated and virulent form of collective identification that grounds itself in biology, that claims the mantle of modern scientific rationality to underpin it. And ultimately, it allows the claim to be made that certain human beings are constitutively inassimilable within a particular collective due to racial differences. So this is very important in its implications for Jewish identity, for instance. The German philosopher Hannah Arendt explained that Jewishness became racialized. That Jews, who of course had been persecuted for centuries in Europe, had nonetheless in the past been able to escape from Judaism into conversion. You could always convert to Christianity, for instance. But that from Jewishness as a racial category, as opposed to Judaism as a religious identification or association, from Jewishness there was no escape. you can change your religious faith, but you can't change your racial makeup or your genetic identity. So what racialization implied is a deep essentialization of identity. Individuals who are inherently identified as racially inferior and therefore can never be brought back into the fold of, say, the nation state, particularly when that nation state becomes identified in racial terms. It's also worth noting that Jews often became a central focus of this racial thinking not because of a lack of integration. Indeed, in the German context, German Jews were among the best integrated. Many of them had secularized, adopted many German customs, fought in the First World War in the German military. Rather, it was precisely because of their integration, because they blurred the boundaries and therefore troubled the processes of boundary drawing implied by racialization, that Jews become all the more problematic in this perspective. They become a fifth column, an invisible enemy in the midst. Note that anti-Semitism, as expressed in the 20th century, always viewed Jews as internationalists. That's to say, as enemies of the nation. And that could be whether Jews were depicted as finance capitalists, so the embodiment of free-floating capitalism, or as communists. So different opposing sides of the political spectrum, but what they have in common, of course, is that they are seen as uprooted from national belonging, from territory and from ground, and therefore a threat to the existence of the nation. So if we think about and look at how the Holocaust was then enacted, we can see several distinct steps through which the Jewish population was progressively marked, segregated, and dehumanized. Incrementally isolated from the rest of the social body, marked with an identity fit for elimination. One of the first of these steps was the introduction of race laws, the so-called Nuremberg laws of 1935, that started to codify the racial identity of the German population and how Jews fitted into it, and how many antecedents, how many ancestors you needed with Jewish background, with German background, to be classified as a German citizen, and which proportion of Jewish heritage, often any form of Jewish heritage, would then classify you as unable to be assimilated as a citizen. So a whole set of laws and regulations allowed individuals to be identified as Jewish as opposed to Germanic. Secondly, we have the marking of these individuals in the public sphere. The most visible sign of that, of course, was the mandatory wearing of the yellow star, which meant that Jews could now be immediately recognized in the street, in public spaces, because of the bearing of this ostentatious sign. And of course, this led to various forms of discrimination and segregation. The fact that certain public spaces were no longer allowed to Jews. We then see the introduction of various economic boycotts. The Nazis enjoined Germans not to purchase goods from Jewish stores. So, as well as isolating them and marking them out, the regime progressively undercut the economic basis for that group, increasingly expropriating its wealth and denying it its economic ground. Finally, social segregation leads to ghettoization. That's to say that the Jewish populations were ultimately moved forcibly to areas where they had to remain. And these would be areas populated entirely by Jewish populations, the so-called Jewish ghettos, most famously the Warsaw Ghetto. So what we see are very clear steps of identification, isolation, and oppression. Patterns that have their own historical specificity in every case, but can also be, I think, identified in their variants in most, if not all, cases of genocide. Ultimately, of course, the Holocaust culminates in the physical killing of the Jewish populations. And the means in which this is done, of course, is also very significant. Omer Bartov speaks of a modern practice of industrial killing, of the mechanized, rational, impersonal, and sustained mass destruction of human beings, organized and administered by states, legitimized and set into motion by scientists and jurists, sanctioned and popularized by academics and intellectuals. And so here we get to a very important secondary aspect of the modernity of the Holocaust. We've talked about the modern aims of the Holocaust, the ways in which the Holocaust had its origins in a set of modern Enlightenment ideals. But here we also address the ways in which the very means of the Holocaust are also modern through and through. We might think of the role of transport logistics, moving Jewish populations in large numbers around Europe into camps and ultimately to their annihilation. One might think about the role of mechanization and of a complex division of labor involved in implementing what became known as the final solution, the ultimate killing of the Jews. One could look at the continuous pursuit of efficiency and optimization of the process, that the Holocaust progressed in an incremental fashion. Different ways of killing and of disposing with bodies was implemented. And we find a very much an industrial efficiency-seeking process in place that goes so far as to involve the recycling of body parts, ways in which gold teeth were extracted, hair and other parts of the body were then reused for industrial processes. Key to this quite dreadful activity is the role of bureaucracy. And remember, we've talked previously about the role of bureaucracy in the modern state and how Max Weber particularly had insisted that modern societies are characterized by bureaucracy, which is itself a highly rational form of organization. And so the Holocaust was as much a bureaucratization of slaughter as an industrialization of slaughter. Indeed, according to one of the main historical approaches to the Holocaust, the so-called functionalist approach, bureaucratic competition and evolution towards the final solution of the Jewish problem was key to its development. In other words, the claim of functionalist historians is that the gas chamber, the creation of the extermination camp was not something that was planned from the outset. And in this they differ from intentionalist historians who tend to emphasize the idea that in fact everything proceeded according to an original intention to perpetrate genocide. According to this functionalist account, really what produced this outcome was a progressive competition between various parties, technical, bureaucratic innovations in order to achieve or to respond to the very broadly defined aspirations put forward by Adolf Hitler, identifying the idea of a Jewish problem. So, for instance, this would explain why prior to the development of death camps, there were a variety of solutions explored that ranged from immigration and resettlement. That, for example, the one plan was referred to as the Madagascar Plan. It intended to use the French colony of Madagascar, which would fall into German hands after the defeat of France, and to use that for the resettlement of the Jewish population. And even when the policy moved towards extermination, there were incremental steps in it. The original killing took place through so-called Einsatzgruppen, individual or groups of SS that were dispatched to kill populations and to dig mass graves. The development of gas wagons, in which the exhaust of a gas of an engine was then used to kill populations, all the way to the final refinement of the extermination camp. So that we cannot really understand the process of the Holocaust without paying attention to these bureaucratic processes. This is what prompts Bauman to argue that the final solution did not clash at any stage with the rational pursuit of efficient, optimal goal implementation. On the contrary, it arose out of a genuinely rational concern, and it was generated by a bureaucracy true to its form and purpose. Moreover, beyond its superior technical efficiency, bureaucratization had two crucial effects which facilitated the Holocaust. The first is that bureaucracy removes very often direct personal responsibility. Individuals follow bureaucratic procedures. Every individual plays a very minor role in a very large chain that culminates in killing. And so it's possible for individuals throughout that chain to disavow their own responsibility. They're only doing their job, they're only doing a small part of the task. Secondly, bureaucratization facilitates the dehumanization of its object. Individuals are reduced to names and numbers within files. They are treated through a euphemistic language that never really confronts what is happening. People are processed, they're not killed, and so forth. So bureaucracy facilitated in a very important way the pursuit of the Holocaust. Perhaps emblematic of this is the figure of Adolf Eichmann, a prominent bureaucrat within the machinery of the Holocaust, who was put to trial in Jerusalem in 1961 and was the object of a book by Hannah Arendt, in which she commented on the banality of evil. She noted that Adolf Eichmann was not especially anti-Semitic, certainly wasn't psychopathic. In fact, he seemed to believe himself to be a very good Kantian. That's to say that he was a good colleague, he was impeccable in his interpersonal relations, he did what he was asked to be done, he was a good public servant. And this is essentially Arendt's point about the banality of evil, that it doesn't take extraordinarily evil individuals to do evil in modern societies. One can think of oneself as a good person and still participate in horrendous acts. Summing up, one of the things that Bauman and others want to draw from the Holocaust is precisely the idea that the Holocaust reveals certain inherent tendencies within modern societies. These potentialities don't necessarily have to be activated. Not all modern societies commit genocide. But many of the aspects of modern societies, both in their self-conception and in the rational means by which they organize themselves, make this kind of mass killing possible.